off though. It's still not showing up on
It's
the
on.
screen. Okay, let me see. We are live on YouTube. Why don't you go out and come back in? See what happens. I'm going to remove you. Greetings, greetings. We're here at Beata's Tiny House Village. And we're going to have a great conversation today on certification of tiny houses or not. What do you think? You think your house needs to be certified? We're going to talk to LA about this. Okay, let's see if we can bring and add LA to the stream. There we are. Thank you. There we are. All right. Well, welcome everybody. LA and I are so glad to be back in the YouTube studio to talk about a very important topic. Hope everybody's doing well. How are you doing, LA?
I'm better than terrific.
I can't hear you. Your voice.
I am better than terrific.
Let me see. Okay, there we go. My volume was down. Okay, how are you doing?
Better than terrific.
Great, great. So LA and I are always talking about how the tiny house movement has changed over the years. I purchased my tiny house in 2015, 7 years ago. Oh my goodness. Since 2015, there have been mucho changes about this whole industry and the movement and the styles, especially. They're bigger than 160 square feet, which I started out in. So we want to talk about one of the biggest changes that has occurred, and that is the idea that your house needs to be certified before you can place it on any land or location. So I'm going to let LA talk about the history of all this and the politics of all that, and then I'll chime in as needed about my own experience with my tiny house. So LA, what about certification? Is it needed or not?
It all depends on who you speak to. On my land, and I've got land in 3 different states, I don't need certification in my particular locations. So, like I say, tiny houses, because it's 2022 right now, June, whatever today's date is, June 7th, 2022. It's still it's in the what I would consider the pioneer phase. All right. To my knowledge, there's no ask 100 people, ask 1,000 people, what's their definition of a tiny house, and you'll get 1,000 different answers. My definition, which is not the official definition, because as of right now, to my knowledge, there's no such thing as an official definition. It's all subjective. Mine is, as I stated a couple of days ago, is 399 square feet on the high end and below. Anything above 399, like say for 400 square feet to maybe 900 to 950 square feet, I would consider it a small house, not a tiny house. And it can cost no more than $25,000 as a retail selling price. Now that's my definition of a tiny house. Is it official? No. But nobody's an official yet. And with the certification people, which anybody can put together a certification agency or business or whatever, I believe they're trying to get a toehold into this tiny house movement, as they call it, which in my opinion It has its pros and its cons.
Okay, now I look at it from a different perspective, and that is my personal experience in trying to sell my tiny house after 5 years living in it. And one of the things I kept running up against, first of all, was people had no idea where they were going to park it. So we covered that in our first video about the first step is to find the land and know the law, right? So that's
Right.
we and that's what I ran into trying to sell my tiny house. People were, "Oh, I'm very interested. Oh, I love your house. But you know any place where I can park it?" I said, "No, I think you better do some research." So the next phase of trying to sell my house, and my guest Carla, who bought my tiny house, she's going to be with me this evening at 6. We're going to talk about health and nutrition in the tiny house. But Carla did not have any issues about certification because she had already purchased semi-rural property outside of Orlando. But one person who I had an offer from on my house was a woman named Yvette, and she was very interested in the house. She had moved here from Texas, and so before she gave me any down payment, she said, "Well, let me find a place for it." And so she came back and said, "Well, is this tiny house certified?" No, it wasn't certified in 2015 because that wasn't even necessary or needed. And I would say most of the people who were building houses, tiny houses, 160 square feet to maybe 500, were not even thinking about certifying the tiny houses. But now, all of a sudden, every place in a major city or major metropolis, I guess you would say, they want to know, is the house certified, especially if it's 5 years, 6 years old. I think the issue, and LA and I have discussed this, is that people don't want low quality housing on their property, or housing that might fall apart in a hurricane, especially you're talking about Florida. Now, where you have property, they don't have hurricanes regularly like we do. But what do you think is behind this new push to have older houses certified? Because most of the newer houses, I think, are being certified as they're built. The builders know that there are lots of certification requirements once that house is completed. So they usually, I think at this point, they're issuing that certification as they sell the house to new buyers. But what do you think is behind this new push for certification in especially even newer houses or older houses?
To answer that question, we need to take a look at the history of the United States. Of course, the birth date of the United States is July 4th, 1776. And most of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence were wealthy, independently wealthy men or people. Now, on July 4th, 1776, there was no such thing as any certification
Oh,
agency in the United States.
okay,
In the
you
United
froze.
States,
Wait, you froze up there.
well,
You started in 1776. There was no such thing as, and then complete that sentence.
okay, in 1776, there was no such thing as any type of regulatory government agency in the United States. Even the United States dollar did not come into existence until 16 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. So each and every year, on the local level, state level, and federal level, there is some individual or individuals that come up with a new way to put their hand out with good sounding regulations, as they call it, as a way to get money. Now, some of these agencies, with some of their rules and regulations, is good. But with tiny, look, you know what? If people weren't in the tiny houses, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. Because with the tiny house movement, one way to look at it, it's revolting against bankers and mortgages. Most people who have a tiny house built them. They built them without government help. They built them without any type of bank or institutional financing. Now somebody wants to come in, under a certification, and basically they have they're regulating, uh, they're attempting to regulate industry. Uber is unregulated. Lyft is unregulated. Airbnb is unregulated. That's how those guys became billionaires due to non-regulation. So right now, July 6th, no, excuse me, not July, June 7th, that's today's date, 2022. Right now, in at least the United States, tiny houses overall is unregulated, but you do have people attempting or forming regulatory or quasi regulatory agencies in attempts to regulate it and control the market. Now, it sounds good. All right, the pro of it is you don't want to buy anything that's going to fall apart. That's the positive thing. But with anything like this, there's the politics. And in the long run, the politics eliminates the little person. Just like mobile homes. Now you have mobile homes, which a lot of them are, the mobile home parks or mom and pop operations. Now you have some mobile home parks that are going out of business due to too much, in my opinion, too much regulation and too much certification. That's my take, at least.
Okay, so I think about my grandfather built his house, and it was a very simple structure, nothing fancy. But my sisters and I would visit that house in Southern Illinois from Chicago. That was like a long drive, and we stayed there every summer for at least a couple of weeks. And he built that house. I'm sure there was hardly any regulations because he had a lot of land around that house, and it was a very small community, and there weren't
Zero,
any governments yeah,
zero regulation. Zero,
no
yeah, zero
government.
regulation. I had a great uncle that in Louisiana. He built houses. He made his own timber. I mean, excuse me, lumber. He would go out into the woods, know what tree to identify, and he only had a fifth or sixth grade formal education. You know, eventually with these tiny houses, people are going to need to have draft engineers, architect papers, and all these regulations and all these degrees or whatever, and all of it's attached to a dollar bill.
So depending on the age of the tiny house, and most we're talking mostly about the ones on wheels, because if you build a permanent structure on land and it doesn't have wheels, that's a whole another ball game. There's all kinds of permits that have to be
Right.
uh, filed, and we're not talking too much about tiny houses, permanent structures like shipping containers. Shipping containers are becoming very popular, and with a shipping container, you're going to have all kinds
And
of types of permits. So the
right.
certification on a shipping container versus a house on wheels is very different because the process of building with a shipping container is like from beginning to end, you're being certified every step of the way. There's a permit here and a permit
Hmm.
here. So on
Right.
wheels, we're talking mostly about houses on wheels. The one I purchased in 2015. Uh, there are now markets for those houses, even Airbnb. You got people. The interview I did recently in Orlando on here. This guy owns at least an acre of property, and he's got Airbnb tiny houses on wheels lining up along the lake. So you those structures had to be certified because I think you're talking about a liability issue when someone's renting that on a regular basis, daily, weekly, whatever. So he doesn't want to carry any liability if it's not certified and so forth. So I think that comes into play in that type of business, where you've got a number of tiny houses involved versus one house on one piece of 2 or 3 acres of land, where you might not be as concerned about certification.
True.
Are you following me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So if you out there bought a tiny house recently and it wasn't certified, there is an agency here in Orlando that will certify that structure for you for a price. Now, I don't know what their price is now, but a year ago, when a potential buyer approached me for my house and discovered when she was trying to find the land that, oh, everybody wants a certification and I didn't have one because it was built 7 years ago. Well, we did find an organization who is involved in building houses on wheels and all kinds of structures that will certify that house for over 2 grand. Now, that was last year. I don't know what, and you'd have to do your own research to find one in your area. So it's not like you can't park in an urban area that needs certification, but again, you're going to have to do your homework and find out how old is the tiny house. Was it certified when it was built? If not, you're going to have to park that tiny house out in the suburbs or in the country, because where I got away with certification for 5 years because the landowner where I parked my house didn't care about certification. He had a whole 11-acre community of trailer homes, homemade homes, homemade sheds, with the cows and the horses. That's why I love the pictures of the cows and the horses that you're going to see on our intro video, because it just reminds me of a simpler lifestyle that costs less because you don't have all the bureaucracy and the red tape of an urban area, which
Correct.
complicates some people.
Correct. And matter of fact, I'm glad that you brought up that example because in the state of Florida where we're at right now, your tiny house would not be legal in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Jacksonville, more than likely Tallahassee. Um, Forget about St. Petersburg within the city, or certain parts of Tampa, Florida. However, like how many miles were you from your place, what in Umatilla to Orlando? How many miles, or how long did it take
I
you?
don't know about
How many?
miles.
Yeah, how many miles away?
It was an hour drive from or major or the middle central
So
or
we're talking about 50 to 60 minutes.
yeah.
Okay, it exactly as we've discussed on here before. Particularly if people are looking for a place to park their tiny house, you got to go. And in this case with you, it was an hour outside or a 50 to 60-minute drive, depending on traffic, away from Orlando because Orlando is a major population hub. The more people, the more rules and regulation, the more government, the less freedom. Now, now we're talking about tiny houses on wheels. Now there is an exception in a place like Orlando, where I'm at in Polk County, and that is um, because before the term tiny houses came into use, people down here were calling them mother-in-law cottages or granny cottages. Now there are plenty of those all throughout Florida, but there are rules and regulations on those now. But
Well, those typically those didn't
you
have
can live with a
wheels.
lot of those rules.
Well, granny houses,
Yeah,
mother-in-law
right. They
cottages
don't have wheels.
didn't have wheels. Now, my tiny house on wheels would be legal in those locations you mentioned if it has a certification with it. That's the thing we discovered when I was trying to sell my house. My house is strong. This house was built to sustain 150-mile-hour winds. So that's how I paid 30 grand for this house back in 2015. It's a small house, literally a small house, but it has the structure, the wood, and all the things that LA's teaching us we're going to need with the tools and everything to build your own house. Same strength and quality is in this house, but no certification. So that house could roll into Miami, and you could try and park that somewhere, and they would ask, first thing they would ask is, well, is it certified? If you say no, they're like, no, no thanks, go away. But if you spend $2,500 with this organization that I found, who conducted a workshop several years ago on this topic, then you could probably park the tiny house anywhere where tiny houses are allowed in an urban area. But that's the conversation we're having today is, do you want to spend $2,500 to certify your house on wheels so you can park it pretty much anywhere as there's a space for it and a hookup, because it is a septic hookup and water hookup. It's not off the grid.
Well,
But if you don't want to pay that 2,500, you're going to have to travel an hour away or more from the city where someone owns a farm or a location where they don't care whether it's certified or not.
right, right. Well, like in a place like Washington D.C., unless they change the rules, and I don't know about them, tiny houses are banned. You can
Oh,
only have them as an exhibit. That's it.
wow.
You know.
Crazy, because what's his name, the head of the surgeon, what's his name, he was the head of under Trump.
Yeah,
um
I know who you're talking about. Ben Carson.
Ben
Ben
Car
Carson.
Ben Carson held a tiny house demonstration on the Washington Mall about 4 or 5 years ago, with all these tiny houses displayed in Washington D.C. right there on the mall, talking about sustainable alternative housing. And you mean to tell me that DC doesn't allow tiny houses at all after all that?
Only as an exhibit.
Only as in, what good is that if you don't have a place to live?
Well, let's look at the psychology of a big city. All right. Now, this is a stat that I put out here before. In the United States, you have 19,500 municipalities. That's communities that have a municipal charter. There are 41,000 zip codes in the United States. So, in a city like Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, Orlando, or whatever, um, where you're paying for the comfort and conveniences of living in a city, where in many cases you don't even need a car to go where you got to go. These cities have a payroll to meet. They have retirement funds to paychecks to roll out every month. So, and then infrastructure replacement is expensive. Running a city, the larger the city, the more expensive it is to run it. So where do they get a lot of their tax revenue from? They get it from the private property owner, the private homeowner, via property taxes. All right. With tiny houses on wheels, though that's not tiny house on wheels is not considered real estate. It's considered personal property. Mobile homes are considered personal properties. So what they want some type of revenue collection of it. If it's mobile, they can't touch it. But if it's immobile, once you take those wheels off the tiny house and make it permanent, then your de facto partner, senior partner, is the local tax authority, and then they can assess it every year. What the tiny house people have done, not all, like I said, but the majority of people who live in the tiny house built them, which means the local government can't tax them or assess them their dwelling on a yearly basis. And these local governments are looking for something where they can bring in revenue. And if you don't pay them, because if it's permanently attached to the land, then they can basically levy your property with a lien and then put it up for a tax auction.
Depending on where you live, yes, anything can go wrong or right, and we hope it goes right for you. But we want to help you be prepared either way. That's a shame that Washington D.C. has that type
Well,
of.
it's not only DC. Once again, I would say, once again, there are 19,500 municipalities in the United States. Go find like where I have my first 4 acres of land, you've been there. Most Floridians have never even heard of that place. And once again, if you want to go tiny legally, find a county that has a small population. What's a small population? My definition of a small county has no more than 24 to 25,000 people.
You're break,
Tops.
you're
That's what the
break,
whole county.
you're breaking up and you're frozen. Repeat that, please. You broke up.
All right. If you want to go tiny legally in the United States, look for a county that has a small population. What's
Right.
my definition of a small county with population? A county that has no more than 24 to 25,000 people or less. That's countywide. And then within that county, look for communities that have, I'll just cut to the chase, that have less than 1,000 people living in that community.
So
The
what?
best communities have 400 people or less.
And you might need to lobby for changes in your location on the laws around tiny houses, because as the movement continues to grow and spread, these lawmakers are behind on making life peaceful and easy for residents in their cities. There's no reason not to have some type of account availability of land to put tiny houses on in any city in the United States these days. There's no excuse for that with the high homeless population in our country. There's no excuse for them not easing the laws and regulations regarding tiny houses. So we're going to be talking more and more about how to build your home tiny houses. But today, for the most part, we're talking about what happens after you've built the house and you will need to put it on land. We talked about law, location, and all that. So again, certification is not needed usually if you leave the city area and go out in the suburb, not just suburbs, but out in the country, out in the rural, more rural or semi-rural areas. And that varies with every city. So you have to really do your homework if you want to live simply, smaller, tiny, and more peaceful in a new dwelling other than a McMansion, which are people are leaving McMansions, abandoning McMansions because they can't afford it. As the price of gas goes up, as the price of everything goes up, we want you to consider downsizing and find location, and even build a community. I'm building a village here on YouTube of like minded people and educated people who want to have a simpler and more peaceful life. So that's all I have for today. And I will be uploading another video later with my friend Carla, who bought my tiny house, to share with you the process she went through to find her land and now to develop that land for a community or a village. So, LA, you have any final words for us?
Well, she went one way, I went another way. I look for it. If it's not zone agricultural, I don't want anything to do with it. So the two things I look for is it's got to be, well, number one, it's got to be in a area where the population is less than 400 people. Number one. Number two, it's got to be zone agricultural. Those are my two rules for finding a place to put my tiny house stuff.
Absolutely. Residential zoning or commercial zoning, gonna have a hard time finding a spot for your tiny house. But agriculture, yeah, just join the cows and horses and have a peaceful life, a cleaner life. The air is usually cleaner out there too. So let's just change our attitudes and get with the rhythm of simplicity and joy and harmony. It's a new day, folks. Let's get with it. All right. Thank you, LA.
Mm.
Have a beautiful evening. And I will see you back here in a few hours with my guest, Carla. She's just an amazing soul. Carla has a beautiful tattoo. You can see her tattoo video on this channel. And don't forget to subscribe and like because we're building a village here. A village of like-minded, beautiful, conscious people to help us change our lives. Thank you. See you later.